Well, it looks like the great snow of 2021 is finally over. I went to the grocery store a while ago and there was a huge long line. All I wanted was a little bit of water. So, anywho, that's Texas news. So let's go on to talk about the Bible. So in the last video, I talked about a lot of historical stuff and I left some stuff out that I wanted to include, so I'm going to include it in this video, and I'll be brief about it. But basically, I talked about Paul's letters, but I never even told you who Paul was. I just kind of assumed everybody knows who Paul was. But I wanted to just make sure everybody knows that Paul was not one of the original apostles. Paul was an apostle, but Jesus didn't appear to him until, way after everybody else. So Paul may not have even ever seen Jesus during Jesus's lifetime on earth. So he converted shortly after the resurrection, the ascension, and all that kind of stuff. So he was a bit of a latecomer, but he wrote most of the stuff in the New Testament, so he's still pretty important. And he was personally acquainted with the original apostles, Peter, James, and John, at least, and some others probably. Yeah. So that's Paul. The Gospels. We didn't talk about the authors of the Gospels or anything like that. And the reason I didn't is because the Gospels are mostly anonymous. I mean, they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the author is not named anywhere in the Gospels. When you hear people say that the Gospels are anonymous, they don't necessarily mean nobody knows who wrote the Gospels. They just mean the authors are not named within the body of the Gospels. But as far as the names attached to those Gospels, as far as anybody knows, none of those Gospels ever circulated under any other names. So there was never any controversy about it or anything like that. Only two of them are named after apostles, Matthew and John. What's his name? Papias, who lived in the 2nd century, I think. I'm not sure, but we don't have any more of his writings. But Eusebius, I think in the 4th century, 5th century maybe, I'm not sure. But in his some of his writings, he cited Papias as a source, and he says Papias said that Matthew wrote the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language. Well, the gospel that we have, for one thing, is not simply oracles. It's not sayings. It's a narrative. And besides that, it looks like Matthew was written in Greek, not in Hebrew. And we know that because of, there are some word plays in Greek, or there's some word plays in Matthew that seem to only work in Greek, but they don't work in Hebrew or in Aramaic, which was the primary language. Sometimes when people of that time said Hebrew, they meant Aramaic. Not always, but sometimes. Here I am editing the video again and noticing that I lost my train of thought while I was recording the video. And what I wanted to say at this point was that either Papias was not talking about what we know as the Gospel of Matthew, or he simply didn't know what he was talking about. Because he said that Matthew wrote the sayings of Jesus, or the oracles of Jesus, in the Hebrew language. But Matthew is a narrative that was written in Greek. And so they're either not the same document, or Papias was simply mistaken. So another reason we know Matthew was written in Greek is because he used Mark as a source, and we know Mark was written in Greek. So it seems unlikely he would, follow Mark as closely as he did and write in Hebrew. So yeah, I'm pretty sure Matthew was written in Greek. I mean, there are just a small handful of people you meet every now and then who still think Matthew was written in Hebrew, like the Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe Matthew was written in Hebrew. But the rest of the New Testament was all written in Greek, and I don't think anybody disputes that. In the case of Mark, okay, so the final comment about Matthew is Matthew may have been behind it. You might wonder, why would an apostle, if he's writing a first-hand account, why would he use Mark as a source? He could write his first-hand account. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One might just be for simplicity. If you were writing an account of your childhood and one of your siblings that already written it, you might look at their account and thought, well, I'll just copy a lot of that in here, and then I'll add my own stuff and simplify it for me. That's one reason. Another reason is because most people during that time didn't do their own writing. We think of reading and writing as kind of the same skill, but back then they were two distinct skills. There may have been a lot of people that could read, but very few people could write. Writing was a completely different skill. And so if somebody were going to write a letter or a document or something like that, usually they had, somebody to write it for them. They would either dictate it or that person would take their notes or something like that. And so it could be that Matthew is behind that gospel, but we don't really know for sure. I mean, there has to be some reason for why Matthew's name got attached to that gospel. Maybe it came from a congregation that Matthew, a church that Matthew planted. Who knows? But it could be that, he had somebody write it. Another argument people use sometimes against the apostles writing anything is that they were supposedly all illiterate. Well, we don't know that they were illiterate. We just kind of assume that because I guess maybe most people were illiterate and some of the apostles were fishermen. You wouldn't expect a fisherman to be highly educated or anything. The Jewish people were more educated than most other cultures around that time. So it's possible that, that the apostles could read. Whether they could write seems doubtful. The point I was going for here before I lost my train of thought was that even if the apostles were illiterate, that's no reason to think that they couldn't have composed the gospel, because they could have had somebody else write it for them, take dictation or whatever. I cannot think of the word for the person that takes dictation, but I will make a little title thing on here so you can see it. So we don't know for sure, what role Matthew actually played in the composition of that gospel. But it doesn't really matter that much, because what matters more than the author is the date. I guess it would matter if Matthew himself wrote it. I mean, that would be a first-hand account of Jesus, an eyewitness or whatever. But we can still get historical information from it, if we know when it was composed and the fact that, it's relying on other sources and stuff. So Mark's gospel, Mark and Luke, neither one of them were apostles. And one of the arguments for the fact that Mark and Luke wrote them is the fact that, like in the 2nd century and beyond, when you have a lot of gospels written under different people's names, if you wanted a gospel to carry some weight, you would name it after somebody whose name carried some weight, like one of the original apostles. So you have things like the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Thomas. Well, all those people were apostles. Well, Mark and Luke were not. And so that's one reason to think that probably Mark and Luke did write those Gospels. Another thing is, according to Eusebius, I think, and Eusebius may have been quoting an earlier person, Papias, possibly, I don't remember. I'm doing all this off the top of my head, by the way. But Mark was supposedly a companion of Peter's, or a disciple of Peter's. And shortly after Peter died, Mark wrote this gospel based on everything he had learned from Peter. And so that's the source behind Mark's gospel is Peter. What's his name? There's a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham, I think. And he's got a section in there where he talks about how you can tell in the Gospel of Mark that Peter is behind this gospel, or he's like the main inspiration of the gospel, or something along those lines. And there were a lot of little clues in there. I don't remember what those are, but it's an interesting read, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. There are some apologists that have kind of skewed what Richard Bauckham wrote, and they're running around saying the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. Well, that's just false. To be the most charitable, it's very misleading. I mean, sure, the information in those Gospels, to the degree that they're historical, obviously had to have originated from eyewitnesses. Otherwise, we never could have known it, But to claim that they're eyewitness accounts sounds like they're claiming that the authors themselves were eyewitnesses, and that's just not true. And it's at least not true. And if the story about Mark writing that gospel is true, Mark was not an eyewitness. Luke definitely was not an eyewitness. John was. Matthew was. But Matthew's gospel relied on Mark. So we don't know that Matthew's account, was written by Matthew himself. A lot of people doubt John's was. I personally think John probably was behind that gospel. But that's a very fringe view. My view is very fringe, I admit. As far as Luke goes, Luke was a companion of Paul's. And Luke did meet some of the apostles. He met James, the brother of Jesus. And so, depending on when he wrote that gospel, he could have had access to eyewitnesses. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say as far as the authors of the gospels. I don't hang my hat on the gospels being written by eyewitnesses or anything like that. Luke mentions that that the information in his gospel is handed down from eyewitnesses, and he appears to have consulted multiple sources. So there's that. So let's talk about why we should think that the gospels and let me mention one more other thing about sources. In Paul's letters, it's not just Paul's own testimony. Paul doesn't have a whole lot of historical information about Jesus. He has some historical information about him, but he quotes a lot of oral traditions, and he quotes some hymns and songs and things like that. And those things predate Paul's letters. So Paul's letters, were mostly written in the 50s, but he has oral traditions that he quotes that date from even earlier. And at least one of those probably originated from the apostles that he met in Jerusalem. And I'll talk about that one later on in this series. So why think that these Gospels and Paul contain historical information? Well, for one thing, Paul's writing these letters. Paul never wrote a gospel. So he's recounting oral traditions about Jesus, and he met the apostles. And as far as the Gospels are concerned, one of the reasons is because of the genre. The genre is ancient biography or Greco-Roman biography. And they didn't write biographies the same way we write them. The way we write them is we want to know exactly what happened, word for word. It's got to be totally accurate and everything. But they took a little bit more artistic license back then when they wrote stuff. And so you can compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they'll tell the same stories, but they often tell them in very different ways. And sometimes they simplify them. Like, for example, there's a story where Jesus healed the daughter of somebody named Jairus. And in one account, Jairus himself went to meet Jesus when Jesus was on the way. In another account, Jairus sent his servants to meet Jesus when Jesus was on the way. So there's two different versions of the story. And so that's kind of one example of how they'll sometimes simplify a story. Instead of talking about Jairus' servants going out there and relaying information between Jesus and Jairus and everything, they just had Jairus go out there and meet Jesus. It's just simpler that way. Now, we do that in our own everyday language. Like if you were playing phone tag with somebody, they call you and can't get a hold of you, and you call them, can't get a hold of them. You go back and forth and eventually get a hold of them. Well, if you were telling somebody later on, they said, hey, did you call so-and-so and tell them about what was going on this weekend? You wouldn't tell them of the whole story about the phone tag. You'd probably say, yeah, I called him, told him such and such. You'd simplify the story. We do that all the time. And so there's that. There's also, like in the case of speeches, sometimes speeches are composed by the author of the biography. Now, they're always based on some historical event. Like if you know two people had a conversation and you know that certain information was exchanged in this conversation, you may not know word for word what was said, but if you were writing a biography, you would compose, a speech or conversation or something that expresses what was exchanged in that conversation, something like that. So it may not be word for word. And you can see this kind of thing if you compare Mark's gospel to John's gospel. Mark has Jesus, revealing to the disciples that he's the Messiah, but don't tell anybody. Towards the end of the week, he's a lot more overt, or towards the end of his life, he's a lot more overt about his messianic claims. In John's gospel, he has Jesus just coming right out and saying, I am. I am is the name of the God of the Old Testament. And so John's probably taking a little bit more liberty with, I mean, he's getting Jesus's meaning across probably, but he's probably not quoting Jesus verbatim. Now, Jesus was an itinerant preacher, and the thing about itinerant preachers, or anybody that teaches regularly, is they say the same things over and over again. Like if you're a Christian apologist, and you run some organization and you get hired to give talks at other people's churches, you're going to give the same talks over and over and over again. And if you're a follower of one of these people that teaches, you're going to hear the same thing over and over and over again. So there's a good chance that a lot of the stuff in the Synoptic Gospels is word for word what Jesus said. That may be the case in the parables. Some of his pithier sayings, those things would be remembered. And I can attest to this because there are certain, radio show hosts and stuff that I listen to, and I've listened to them so much that I could tell you verbatim a lot of the things that they say because I've heard it so many times. Even speech patterns that they use, like James White always says, no way, shape, form, or fashion, or something like that. Greg Kokel always says, just because something's possible doesn't mean it's reasonable to believe. Things like that. I mean, I'll probably always remember that. And there's a lot of things like that. And so there's a good chance that a lot of Jesus's words were preserved word for word, but you don't have to take the Gospels to be like it's an ancient biography, but it's not written the way biographies are written today is the point. And so also another thing is I mentioned Luke's prologue in yesterday or the day before yesterday's video. And he talks about how a lot of people had written an account of Jesus, and he says these were things that actually happened. And so Luke is obviously, his intention is obviously to record history. He's trying to record what actually happened. And John says the same thing towards the end of his gospel. He talks about how Jesus did all kinds of things that are not even recorded in that gospel. And so his intention is obviously to record history. And since Matthew and Mark are both the same genre as Luke, then they're probably trying to record history too. And it also just seems, obvious that if Jesus was a real person and there's this whole religion surrounding him, if somebody was going to write an account about Jesus, you would expect that at least some of it would go back to Jesus. Now, a lot of people will want to argue for the general reliability of the Gospels. I'm not going to do that in this series because the case that I'm going to make for Christianity does not depend on the Gospels being generally reliable. All that matters is that at least some of the information in the Gospels is historical, or that we can figure out that some things are historical. I'm going to make a case for Jesus claiming to be the Messiah and for him rising from the dead later on, and that's just going to depend on a handful of historical claims. So I don't need to show that the entire Gospels, everything that they say, is historically reliable. There's Amazon. Maybe they're delivering something for me. Oh, with the Wells Fargo wagon, it's coming down the street. Okay. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So another reason to think that Luke's gospel is historical, and the other gospels as well, is we know that there's a lot of historical information in the book of Acts. And we know this because Acts overlaps with a lot of things that Paul wrote in his letters. In his letters, Paul, these are kind of personal letters that Paul is writing. And so he writes about his own events in his own life. And so there's a lot of information in Acts that overlaps with some of the things that Paul said. And so we know that some of the things in Acts are historical. So if Acts is historical and Acts is like part 2 of Luke's gospel, well, they're probably both historical or based on historical events. So I say all this just to make a statement that 1, the genre is historical, and 2, they're going to contain at least some historical information, and maybe we can use historical methods to figure out what that historical information is, and that's what I plan to do through the rest of this series. There's two more things that I want to address that I'm not going to address in this video because I don't want to be as long as last video, is the transmission of the Bible, basically how we got the Bible today, the transmission, the copying, and all that kind of stuff, and the translations. And so I will do that in another video at another time. Thank you.